I won't need to explain the prayers again. We'll just launch into the prayers that we do to set our motivation for this session. Oh, in Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, I take refuge till I awaken through all the virtues such as giving. May I reach Buddhahood for beings. In Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, I take refuge till I awaken through all the virtues such as giving. May I reach Buddhahood for beings. In Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha, I take refuge till I awaken through all the virtues such as giving. May I reach Buddhahood for beings. Prostrating, offering, confessing, rejoicing, urging, supplicating, whatever virtue I've collected, I dedicate it to awakening. The ground perfumed and strewn with flowers, Meru, four continents, sun and moon. This imagined Buddha field offering, may all beings dwell in the pure realms, according to the different propensities of beings. Please turn the wheel of Dharma, great, lesser, and uncommon. So that will be our motivation, the first prayer really, for the duration of this session of study and practice to attain enlightenment, so that we can help all other beings attain enlightenment and freedom from suffering. So now I have a set of prayers on my own aspirations for this session. And I do them first in Tibetan and then in English. Dadan sem chen tam che loche sudro or zinji lab tu sol, chulam dudro or zinji lab tu sol, lam trulpa selo or jinji lab tu sol, trulpa yeshe suchar or zinji lab tu sol. I pray for blessing. May my mind and the minds of all sentient beings turn toward the Dharma. I pray for blessing. May the Dharma become the path. I pray for blessing. May the path clarify confusion. I pray for blessing. May confusion arise as wisdom. I pray for blessing. May my mind and the minds of all sentient beings turn toward the Dharma. I pray for blessing. May the Dharma become the path. I pray for blessing. May the path clarify confusion. I pray for blessing. May confusion arise as wisdom. Lai ke dang lu dang nu jin ke chulbum da dang mi ke nam dang droa kunji dra ke jit sampar tam che ke du da ki chitan to. In the tongues of nagas, yakshas, gods, those of demons and of humans too, in the many languages there are, may I teach the Dharma in them all. And then we begin by arousing what is called bodhicitta, the wish to attain enlightenment, again, for the benefit of other beings, all other beings, that we may help bring them to freedom from suffering and to enlightenment. And we say that in a formal way as we begin to teach. So to begin, please give rise to the thought that in order to benefit all sentient beings whose numbers fill the extent of space, I must attain the level of perfect enlightenment. In order to bring this about, I will practice the profound Mahayana Dharma by way of study, contemplation, and meditation. So can everybody hear me okay? And is the microphone okay there? Is it?
Just in case you may need it.
Oh, I see. Okay. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay, good. Well, we'll hope that lasts. So what we just recited together and what I just recited represents the first strength or power, which we studied all 5 of them last night, and we'll go through them again before we go through how to use them at the time that we're dying. But the first one is motivation. So we've all set our motivation as bodhicitta, and I've set my personal motivation the same. May everything that we study here today together benefit us all and help us to attain enlightenment in order to help all sentient beings do the same. So the teaching today, same as last night, is from the 7 Points of Mind training, composed by the glorious Lord Atisha, who was a teacher in the 11th century in India, and he was a teacher who helped bring the Buddha's teachings to the very wild country of Tibet. And these teachings were later, they were all oral teachings up until the time of a Tibetan teacher named Chakawa Yeshe Dorje in Atisha's tradition, about in the 12th century, so about a century later. And so that's the root text from which the 5 strengths come. And this presentation that I'm giving this weekend is based mainly on a teaching that was given by Lama Norla Rinpoche as part of the Dharma Path program at our monastery, Kagyu Tupten Shuling, which is the program that we have for lay practitioners to go through sort of all the steps of the path, similar to the way that we do it in our 3-year retreat program. And his teaching in 2009 was based on a commentary given by Khenchen Trangyu Rinpoche, who's another very great teacher in the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism. And so that's the main basis for this particular presentation of the 5 strengths. But I'm also going to draw from commentaries by other great teachers of the Kagyu lineage, notably Jamgon Kongtrul Lodru Taye, who was a 19th century, very great 19th century teacher, who handed down many of the practices that we do today in the form in which they exist, and also sort of originated the current structure of the 3-year retreat program back in the 19th century. It remains very viable today. And his 19th century commentary on the 7 Points of Mind training, which is called The Great Path to Awakening, is the basis for all of the other commentaries by contemporary teachers. And I draw upon, in particular, the commentaries of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche and his student Lama Chödron. So we have a lot of great commentaries on this particular topic. So again, as I said last night, the 7 Points of Mind training is what we call a root text, a basic text, consisting of 59 slogans for practice, both in formal meditation and in daily life. And we're going to maybe touch today, a little bit later, upon one of them, which is the instruction for taking and sending meditation, or Tonglen. So that's actually one of the slogans, one of the 59 slogans in the 7 Points of Mind training, and it's the basic meditation technique for cultivating what we call relative bodhicitta, which is cultivating love and compassion. So within the 7 Points of Mind training, there are 2 slogans that are related to the 5 strengths, and that is our topic this weekend. And the first slogan tells us how to practice during our lifetime, and that's what we went over last night. Just what each slogan basically, what each of the 5 strengths basically is, and how we apply it on a daily basis in our lives. And that slogan is slogan 17, and in the root text, it says, the essential instructions can be summed up as follows: practice the 5 strengths. So that is the essential instruction for our practice. The 5 strengths can be applied to any practice that we do. So that's what makes them essential instructions. They really speak to the essence of every kind of practice. So let's see. So yesterday we learned what the 5 strengths are, and we went over each one. So the first one is motivation, and we just practiced that one by doing the prayers and remembering bodhicitta. The second one is called practice or familiarization, the way we build up new habits. The third one is called the power of virtue, or the power of positive seeds. The fourth one is the power of rejection, and the fifth one is the power of aspiration. And I'm going to go over each one of those briefly again. But I wanted to, as I did last night, I'd like to start out with a very brief explanation of the 4 thoughts, the 4 reminders that help motivate us. That's an important part of our motivation to practice overall, is the 4 thoughts or the 4 reminders. The first one is to remember and just be mindful of what a precious opportunity we have, that we have everything that we need in terms of like our material needs are met to whatever extent they're met. They're met enough that we can be sitting here today, turning our minds to the Dharma. You know, we don't have to be out there like looking for food or looking for shelter. We actually have the leisure in this lifetime, and we have everything that we need to turn our minds to the Dharma, to actually traveling the path to awakening and to helping all sentient beings. So that's the first of the four thoughts, the first thing to bring to mind as we wonder what's the need to do Dharma practice. The second of the four thoughts is impermanence and death, and that is that this opportunity, like everything else, is going to come to an end, and we don't know when that's going to be. We could have a long time or we could have a short time, and since we don't know, it's very important to actually practice now, to actually make use of the opportunity right now. The third of the four reminders is the law of karma, cause and result. And what that means is that we are ultimately the masters of our own fate. Everything that we experience comes from actions that we've previously performed, and the actions that we perform in our lifetime now determine what our experience will be in the future. And it's a very complex topic, but it can be boiled down in like its most basic sense to, you know, helpful or positive actions bring happiness, and negative or harmful actions bring suffering. So that's a really good guide, like for all of our actions in this life. If we have a choice between doing something that's helpful and doing something that's harmful, we want to pick helpful, because that will bring us happiness in the future, and that will help us travel the path that will take us out of this, you know, cycle of suffering that is samsara, this going round and around and around again, experiencing the same kinds of suffering again and again from lifetime to lifetime. And if we engage in actions that are harmful to others, that digs us in deeper and means that we'll be longer in the cycle of suffering. And then the fourth is the reasons that we want to get out of this situation. Why do we need to get out of samsara? Because it contains really ultimately nothing but suffering. Everything leads to suffering, one way or another. All of our experiences are in some way permeated by suffering. Even you know, maybe it's a really wonderful experience, but the Buddha considered even wonderful, happy experiences to be ultimately a form of suffering, because at the very least they end. You know, if nothing else, they end. But sometimes they lead to suffering even though they feel pleasurable. And we used the example last night just of eating too much cake or pie. You know, it feels really good when you're doing it, and then wham, you know, you feel really bad, you get sick, you gain weight, whatever. And you reinforce that pattern, so that means you're more likely to do it again and again. So, and we talked about the 6 realms, or the 6 life states, as Bushi called them. We can think of them as physical states, or we can think of them as psychological states, but they're states, many of them are states in which there's really no possibility of practicing. The hell realms, which are characterized by intense anger and the suffering that comes from that. The hungry ghost realm that's characterized by intense neediness, just always having to look to fill your basic needs, to get enough food, and so forth. The animal realm, which, you know, we can see animals don't have a lot of control over what happens to them, and very often their lives are just characterized by fear, like they have to eat other animals, which creates negative karma for them, and then they have to worry that somebody's going to eat them. So they don't, and they also don't have the intellectual capacity to study and practice the Dharma. And then there's the God's realm at the other end of things, where you have all of your needs fulfilled, everything you could possibly want, and you don't have any motivation to practice the Dharma. So those are the 4 things to remember when we have trouble motivating ourselves to practice, when we have trouble calling the first strength, you know, to our aid. It's good to remember the 4 reminders. So let's see. I'm looking to see if what I wrote here is actually a review of the five strengths as I explained them yesterday. So yesterday we learned that the 5 strengths are motivation, practice, virtue, rejection, and aspiration. And we talked about how to practice these during our lifetime. During our lifetime, motivation is defined as the impetus that inspires us to take up the practice of Dharma, which is the path to realizing our full potential. Practice, the second of the 5 strengths, is the sort of day-to-day effort to bring that motivation to fruition. Actually doing the work, getting up every day, and as Trungpa Rinpoche, getting up every day and just reinforcing your resolve that you're going to do things that are helpful to other beings and yourself, and you're not going to fall into patterns that are negative as much as possible. And he said that that should be a joyful state. The third is virtue, the practice of virtue, or the power of virtue, and that is the beneficial actions that we can undertake to increase our momentum on the path, to give ourselves a little extra push. And so Lama Norla Rinpoche mentioned that we can do actions of body such as prostrations, circumambulation, practicing generosity, and so forth, and actions of speech such as mantras and the recitation of prayers. And then mentally we can meditate. And then the fourth of the 5 strengths is rejection, and that is the recognition that all of our suffering is ultimately rooted in ego clinging. It's a very important point. And the attitude that emotions and actions that come out of ego clinging are not going to bring us happiness, but instead are the cause of our suffering. And based on that, we resolve to not follow our ego clinging, but to see through it. And again, Trungpa Rinpoche had a very helpful action plan here, where we can actually talk to ourselves. When we see ourselves perhaps about to engage in something that we know is negative, but we're having trouble stopping ourselves, we can actually talk to our ego clinging and say, ego clinging, you've gotten me into trouble for lifetime after lifetime, and I'm just not going to follow you now. So that is rejection. What we're rejecting is ego clinging, like that basic tendency to put ourselves first, to think about our own benefit first, to need to be right, and so forth. Just to see things from our own point of view, to have a very fixed point of view and operate out of that. That is ego clinging, and we reject the negative emotions that come out of ego clinging, such as attachment, aversion, pride, jealousy, and so forth. And then we reject the actions that come out of those emotions, the negative actions, where we're just working in some way to build up our own ego, to build up our own benefit, sometimes at the expense of others. So we resolve not to follow our ego clinging, but to see through it. So we're not trying to get rid of something here. We're really, again, as I went into it in some detail last night, the main point is to recognize, just to recognize ego clinging, recognize where our actions are leading us as we're on the verge of doing things, and see through them. See that ask ourselves whether they're going to bring us happiness or suffering, whether they're going to benefit others or whether they're going to in some way be harmful to others. So the 5th strength or aspiration is remembering in all of our practice and activities, our most basic aspiration as Dharma practitioners, which is bodhicitta, the wish to benefit others. And also using our time to reinforce our motivation through reciting prayers such as the bodhicitta prayer. So the difference between, I would sum up the difference between motivation, which is the 1st strength, and aspiration as the 2nd strength, as the 5th strength, as aspiration is a way to reinforce our motivation. It's like prayers that we can engage in, and just remembering as much as we can, and making prayers that we are able to carry through this motivation to fruition. So during our lifetime, that is how the 5 strengths are defined. And that's hopefully going to be the bulk of our practice. We hopefully have a lot of time left before we get to the point where we know that we're going to die, and we have to sort of adapt these. So the more we practice these in our lifetime, the more they're going to help us at the time that we're dying. Missing a page. There it is. So that's how the 5 strengths are defined, what we went over yesterday and just reviewed now. And that's the basic order in which we practice them. during our lifetime. Of course, in practice, they're all mixed together, really. But when we recall them, when we think about them, that's the order. Motivation, practice, virtue, rejection, and aspiration. However, when we realize that we're in the actual process of dying, that's when we get the diagnosis, like the terminal diagnosis, or we realize that we're falling off the cliff or about to be hit by the bus. We're going to practice the 5 strengths in a different order and a slightly different way. They have a different emphasis when we know that we're dying. They take on a different meaning in this process. So hopefully we will all die in a way that allows us a little leisure to put the 5 strengths into practice. And that's what we're going to focus on today. I'm going to just take off my watch so that I know what time it is. Since everybody was here last night, I'm looking at what I can skip. So just to review what Lama Rinpoche said generally about the 5 strengths. They are the 5 essential elements, or they are 5 essential elements that taken together encompass the meaning of all Dharma. And according to Lama Rinpoche, if you practice with these 5 forces, they make it easy to practice. Whatever we're practicing, they make it easier. And Trungpa Rinpoche also refers to them as energizing factors. They are ways to practice that energize our entire practice, whether it's formal practice or whether it's, going through daily life. So when we know that we're dying, the slogan for practicing at the time of death, so that was slogan 17 before. The essential instructions are practice the 5 strengths. Slogan 18, the next slogan, is the Mahayana instruction for leaving the body is the 5 strengths. Your conduct at this time is important. And that second sentence has a very, very particular meaning that we'll get to a little bit later. So for right now, what we're working with is the Mahayana instruction for leaving the body is the 5 strengths. Jamgon Kongtrul Lodru Taye, the 19th century teacher who wrote the original commentary that we work with on this topic, said, when a person who has trained in this teaching is stricken by terminal illness, he or she should practice the 5 forces. So when you know that you're dying, that's what it's important to bring to mind, is the 5 forces, which can help us through this time of death. So the strengths to be applied at the time of death are the same as before, but the order of application is different. So when we find out that we're going to die soon, the first strength that we generate is the power of virtue. That's the one where during our lifetime we're circumambulating and we're practicing generosity and we're doing mantras and so forth. But here it has a different meaning. According to Jamgon Kongtrul, what this means is that, quote, we should give away all our possessions without a trace of attachment, clinging, or concern. So that's the first thing that should come to mind when we learn that we're dying is how can I give my stuff away? If the bus is coming, you can only do it with a thought, and I'll get to that. But if you have some leisure, you actually can think about it. You actually can plan how you're going to give all of your things away. So Jamgon Kongtrul recommends that in general, we make offerings to the 3 jewels. That is, we turn our possessions to spiritual use as much as we can. But he says, in particular, they can be given, our possessions can be given wherever the person thinks they will be most helpful. So we can make offerings to the 3 jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, who will use them to benefit all beings. And we can also give things away to our family and friends and to charities that we feel are beneficial and so forth. Trungpa Rinpoche said, and he's the teacher that Lama Rinpoche based his teaching on Trungpa Rinpoche's commentary. He said that we should think whatever merit I have accumulated, my body and all my possessions, everything I have enjoyed in this life, I offer these to the 3 jewels. If we're not physically able to offer these things, maybe we're too weak, maybe we can't get around to do it, or maybe the bus is coming at us at this moment, we can Just thinking that we offer them accomplishes the power of virtue and gives us positive momentum on the spiritual path. So the main point of the power of virtue in the context of dying is that giving away our possessions helps decrease our attachment to this life and makes it easier to let go. And it also accumulates merit through the practice of generosity. So it's kind of a double win there. You know, we're working, because we are attached to our things. Like even if we're very, diligent Dharma practitioners, there are things that we are attached to in our lives. Someone once asked the Dalai Lama what he was attached to, if there was anything he was attached to. And he said, my mala, that's his prayer beads. He was attached to his prayer beads. Whatever it is we're attached to, we have this opportunity as we know that we're leaving this life to cut through that attachment by giving things away. So it's important to remember as we apply the five forces that in Buddhism, death is not the end of the road. Kalu Rinpoche, who was Lama Norla Rinpoche's Lama, once said that dying is like going from one room to another. So whatever we do in this life, up to the very moment of our death, is going to have a positive or a negative effect on our next lifetime and on all our future lifetimes. So giving away all of our things, either in action or just by thinking, at the time we know we're dying, is a way, it's going to have a positive influence on our future after we die. Lama Norla Rinpoche, another thing he said that I've always remembered, is that we tend to plan for the end of our lives up to the nursing home. But we don't really, and maybe up to our funeral. He said the nursing home in that context, but we don't really think about after we die. Because in our culture, I guess we're not so much used to thinking of that. But Buddhist practice is all about thinking about what's going to happen to us after we die. Like, how can we make that the most positive and most meaningful experience? Everything is really about that. And so this is a very positive way that we can practice at that time and benefit ourselves and put ourselves in a position to be of more benefit to other beings, because the less attachment that we carry with us into the next lifetime, the more our minds are going to be open and free and able to benefit other beings. So that is the power, how we practice the power of virtue when we know that we're dying. And that's the first of the five strengths that we think of at this time. Second is the power of aspiration, which was the last one during our lifetime. So as we're dying, we can make aspiration prayers for our next life and all our future lives. And at the same time, these prayers will reinforce our aspirations and also make our mind happier for the remainder of this lifetime. So again, Zhang-Gong Kongtrul, the 19th century teacher, said, the force of aspiration means to make enlightenment the single focus of aspiration. So as we're dying, rather than dwelling on thoughts of the past or dwelling on our present fears, if we have any, the most helpful and powerful thing we can do is to keep our mind focused on bodhicitta, our goal as spiritual practitioners of attaining enlightenment in order to help free all beings from suffering. So specific aspirations we can make at this time, according to Lama Norla Rinpoche, include praying that we never forget bodhicitta in our future lifetimes. And these are actually, in Tibetan Buddhism, we believe in just these prayers. These are kind of formulas that we can say. They're already, they're ready-made for us. And we can just use them and say them again and again. So it's actually considered very helpful to actually say the words. It's a step beyond thinking it. It actually brings it into it internalizes it more, and it just makes it stronger if we actually say it. So it's like Trungpa Rinpoche is saying we should talk to our ego clinging. It actually helps if we bring speech and action into the equation. So some of the specific aspirations we can make at the time that we know we're dying are praying that we never forget bodhicitta in our future lifetimes, praying that we not fall under the sway of self-cherishing and the mental afflictions, praying that we meet teachers in all our future lives who teach the profound, genuine Dharma, and that all our aspirations be fulfilled through the blessings of the three jewels. So that is the power of aspiration at the time that we're dying. And these are the kinds of thoughts it's most helpful to have in mind as much as possible as we go through the process of leaving this life. So third is the power of rejection. And that was the fourth one before. So when we're dying, most of us experience some degree of suffering and pain. We have drugs to take care of a lot of that, but a lot of times there is some level of suffering and pain. Mental suffering, sometimes we're thinking about things that we did in the past, or we're just very caught up in like not wanting to die and so forth. So at that time, it's important to remember that the root cause of all our suffering and pain is our own karma, which has come from our previous actions, which have come from our mental afflictions, whose source in turn is ego clinging or self-cherishing, our basic orientation of I, me, and mine. So remembering this helps us drive all blames into one, that slogan 12. And we didn't go over that yesterday, but the 12th slogan in the 7 Points of Mind training is one of the most famous ones, one of the best known ones. Drive all blames into one. And what that means is that when something bad happens, even if there is like an obvious perpetrator who's doing something harmful to us, the most helpful thing is not to dwell upon blame for some external person or external circumstance, but to remember that what causes us suffering about it is our ego clinging. When someone's screaming at us in anger, it's really our ego that's hurt. Like if we can detach ourselves from our ego clinging at that point, then it's just words, and it really doesn't have any effect on us at all. It doesn't have any meaning. It's as if they were screaming at us in a foreign language and we had no idea what they were saying. It's when our ego feels hurt that it causes us suffering. So rather than blaming our external circumstances when we're dying, blaming our doctors, blaming our lawyers, blaming our germs, blaming whatever we feel may have contributed to our dying at this time and to our suffering because we're dying. If we can turn our minds to recognizing, A, that dying is inevitable. It happens to everyone. It may be happening earlier than we'd like or in some way that we don't like, but everybody's going to die. So dying is inevitable, and that the suffering that we experience when we're dying really only comes from ego clinging. It really only comes from wanting things to be different than they are, wanting our experience to be only pleasurable and only beneficial to ourselves. Our suffering really only comes from that clinging. So in this way, on our deathbed, we can very powerfully reject ego clinging and weaken it for future lifetimes. So that's the power of rejection. And again, the time of death, in Buddhism, the time of death, when we're dying, from the moment we know we're dying up until the moment we leave the body, is considered an extremely powerful time. And how we use our mind at that time is a very important factor in determining what happens to us after we die, how much suffering we have in the bardo, where we go in our next lifetime, and so forth. So we want our minds to be as positive and as focused on meaningful things when we're dying as possible. And so that's what our training during our lifetime is about. When we use the 5 powers, apply the 5 powers during our lifetime, it's really about that. It's about clearing out our minds as much as possible and turning them as much as possible towards this path that will lead us to freedom from suffering and awakening, enlightenment, the ability to really help others. And then when we're dying, the more we've practiced it, the more it comes to our rescue at that time. But even if we haven't practiced it a lot, if we can remember these 5 powers at that time, you might want to have a list somewhere, that you can just pull out, like when you get when you're going to the doctor, you're having some symptoms, you're going to the doctor, have the list. Like, okay, power of virtue, give everything away. Power of aspiration, okay, in my next life, may I meet teachers and may I be able to practice effectively and may I always have bodhicitta and may I never be angry. And remember the power of rejection, that any suffering I'm going to have during this whole process, this really comes from my ego clinging. It doesn't come from the fact that I'm dying. It doesn't come from the fact that it's somebody's fault that I'm dying. It really comes from the fact that I don't want to die, that I want benefit for myself. And if I can just cut through that, like the more I can cut through that, we may not be able to cut through it all the way, because we have a lot of habit built up over many lifetimes, as Lama Chödron said. But the more we can chip away at it, just every minute that we think it's my ego clinging, even if it comes right back, you've weakened it a little bit. You have to do it over and over again, and that's the power of practice, really. They're really all mixed up together. You might have thought comes again, I don't want to die, ego clinging. I really don't want to die, it's ego clinging. You just have to say it to yourself again and again, and every time you say it, it has an effect. So we, in the West especially, we tend to be perfectionists. Like, we think we do it one time and it should be done. Like, and if it's not done, if it comes back, we failed and we're not able to do it, so we're just going to go do something else. But it doesn't work like that. Like, it's imperceptible. Like, the benefit of things like this, these are subtle things, and the benefit is imperceptible in the short term. One of the things Lama Chödron Rinpoche said to me back probably in 1980, the first year I was studying with him, was any amount of Dharma practice you do is going to benefit you. It's really going to have an effect. But don't look back the next day after you meditated for the first time, because you're not going to see it then. Give yourself weeks, give yourself months. Look back in 6 months, look back in a year. So you've really got to invest a lot in the process before you really see a big enough effect that it's visible. But have faith. You know, the Buddha taught that it really works. And so it's good if we can have faith that every single time we do any kind of practice and bring any kind of dharmic thought to mind, it really does have an effect. And so the more we do it, the more it builds up that opposite habit. And again, that's the power of practice that really permeates all of the other practices, all of the other strengths that we do. So that's the power of rejection. Does anybody have any questions or any thoughts or comments they'd like to share at this time? While I'm having a drink of water. See how.
I was thinking about the statement you made last night about a difference in Tibetan thought and thought in the United States. Mm-hmm. Is that self-doubt?
Yeah, self-doubt.
Yeah, can you say a bit more about that? That seems to be an action going on in so many of these issues.
Yeah, I think it's sort of what I was just saying a little bit, that we have very high expectations of ourselves in this culture, and so we set a very high bar, and it's very easy not to measure up to it. Somebody once said to me, if you can achieve 20% of what you think you should achieve, you should be really happy about that. Mm-hmm. And in fact, one of the things that's most influenced my path and my perfectionism is that C.T. Rinpoche. Do people know who C.T. Rinpoche is? He's a wonderful teacher. He's in India. He used to come and teach at the monastery every year, but he hasn't been able to travel in recent years. He's a fabulous teacher. He's my age. He'll be 60 this year. And he once said to us, he used to come every year and teach. He knows the Western mind really well. He speaks English. He's the first of the Tibetans, like the original generation of Tibetans who teaches in English. And so he just knows our minds, he knows our psychology, and he said, don't panic. If you improve by 1% in this lifetime, that's really good. So don't think like you failed if you don't attain Buddhahood right now, like through your first practice. You know, if you don't achieve the goal at the beginning, it doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means you have to keep going. And that's the strength of practice, the second strength during our lifetime, and it's going to be the fifth strength when we're dying. The power of practice is just to keep going and not keep looking at that goal. Because if you keep looking at how far you are from your goal and that's what your focus is, you're